A little boy, 7 years old, suffering from a rare, aggressive form of brain cancer, and he's restricted to the hospital and a bed in Rhode Island, but he wants desperately to sing his favorite song, Walk This Way, with rock star Steven Tyler. Now, I just got to tell you, why anybody would want to do that, I do not know. I just want to go on record. So for those of you who already know who I'm talking about. Through a Skype video call, the 7-year-old by the name of Cole Grace got the front man for Aerosmith, Steven Tyler, and he connects and have a 1-hour conversation. And they also share a performance of Walk This Way, and Tyler even gives him a shout out on his seat on American Idol. Thanks be, he's no longer on that program, but nevertheless, they had that moment in time. The little boy said it felt pretty awesome. Now, you know, all across the world, literally not just America, but all across the world, all across continents, we now have virtual meetings, moments in time when we, in fact, can talk personally with somebody. There is also the case of face-to-face that Stephen Manacor of Big Ideas blog, he questions whether these web conferences are really going to replace the face-to-face contact. If you're a bit of a movie buff, and you know that I am, you know that in the movie Up in the Air, George Clooney plays a man by the name of Ryan Bingham. And he works for an Omaha-based center of transitional counseling. And that's a fancy name to say that his company hires him to go in and fire people. And he does it really, really well. He goes in and he faces the anguish and the hostility and the people that just are meeting and having their worst day. And the whole movie is about his false compassionate feelings that he is living out of a suitcase, and at least in his frame of reference, he's enjoying himself all the while. But along comes somebody new. His boss hires a lady by the name of Natalie, who's played by Anna Kendrick. And she develops what they call a method of video conferencing that will allow people to terminate other people without ever leaving the office. And so the whole movie is a telling back and forth of that story. And what we find out is that the young lady, with all the vim and vigor that she has, she starts to realize the disheartening realities of her profession, along with the old pro who sees the downfalls of his own way of life. Why? Why will this video conferencing, why will this FaceTime, why will this secondary way of communication never really completely overcome the incredible value of face-to-face? Today, I want to make the case for face. The fact that it was even with Moses that he sought a face with God. Now, we'll do some of the theological stuff in a moment, but go back to that study Manacor does. He cites a study from Forbes magazine where they studied a few years ago 750 businesses, and they came up with the fact that 80% of all the executives said they still prefer face-to-face contact because the level of brainstorming and strategy and trust and all the things that matter simply are much more important. Think about it. Take a look at the parents in the congregation of the kids today that have kids in college. Take a look at the grandparents and stupidity that we face as grandparents when our grandkids come into the world. Many of us are Skyping and FaceTiming, and yes, by the way, that is now formally a verb. So let's dive into the outline. God, Moses, and Skype. What if God and Moses had just Skyped? Now, I'm not being cute. I'm really kind of looking at this. Moses needed, and mark that, underline it, exclamate it, Moses needed a moment with God. It was at a time where he said, I will not, cannot go any further if you do not go with me. That happened in the previous chapter. Now look at chapter 34. I'll read it with you. it came about that when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hand as he was coming down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because of his speaking with him. So when Aaron and all the sons of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of the face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. And then Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation returned to them. And Moses spoke to them, and afterwards all the sons of Israel came near and commanded them to do everything that the Lord had spoken to him on Mount Sinai. And so when Moses had finished speaking with him, he put a veil over his face. Whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take off the veil until he came out. And whenever he came out, he spoke to the sons of Israel what he had been commanded. The sons of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face shone. So Moses would replace the veil over his face until he went in to speak with him. It seems like the text is telling us that Moses was on Mount Sinai with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. And during that time, he did not even take time to eat or to drink, evidently. No pastries, no Starbucks going on here. It says that Moses took this time incredibly seriously. He dove into the moment. And the words in Exodus 34:28, the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. Now, I have to pause here because I think of him bringing down those 2 tablets that we've seen so many times about a cartoon that's circulating on the internet, and it has at the pearly gates, and St. Peter is introducing, and I'm not sure this would ever happen anyway, but St. Peter's introducing Steve Jobs, the guy that started Apple Computers. St. Peter's introducing Steve Jobs to Moses, and St. Peter says, Moses, meet Steve. He's going to upgrade your tablets. Now see, you needed to know that today about the tablets. I guarantee you, most of you will remember that more than you'll remember about some of the other stuff. Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and I don't know exactly what he said. I mean, some people have said, he came out and said, here they are, read them and weep. This is really the way it is, and I need for you to know that. But really, he went much further than that. He calls to the people, and he speaks to them, and this face-to-face moment, he came down with a sense of persuasion and leadership and hope and possibility. Now, I would love to tell you that every time I come to you, you should see a shining face. It's my hope because every week I hope that I have been in the presence of God such that what I talk about and what I see and what I understand is in fact from the presence of God. So point number 2, what does all this matter? Why does this matter? Time to go face to face in the church and in the world. You got your insert again this week. We have been on a journey trying to discover and to discern God's will. I hope each week you will take time to read that. If you've not filled it out yet on the one side where you can turn it in, I hope that you will do that. We are beginning to put lists together. We're beginning to contemplate when in fact that might happen. And the preliminary first possibility would be the week following Easter. Now, I don't know if we'll be ready by then, but it would be the easiest time to make a transition because after Easter, everybody's kind of sensitized because hopefully most of the folks that are connected to the body of Christ here at our church would be that. So take time, if you would, and fill that out and drop it with me as you leave the building today. So what was Moses say? Let's imagine that Moses was giving us an SMS or a short messaging service. It's a system, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, that enables cell phones to send and receive text messages. So let's just kind of use our imagination for that. Number 1 is take time to build a relationship with God. There is no possibility, and I'll be saying this pretty strongly a couple times. There is no possibility that you can spend time with God and be the same person. There is no possibility that the light of God's face shining into your life can happen there and it not change you. It's not possible. It's not possible to be in the presence of God and to not sense that He is going to stir you and move you to some new places. Moses could have asked God to call in. Hey, God, let's do the vision thing. This hiking to the top of Sinai is no picnic. I got these bad knees. Send me a vision, if you would. No, he knew. Matter of fact, if you've been reading through here, Exodus 34 and 33, he strongly suggests that Moses spoke to God regularly. 33:11 says, "Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend." I just got to tell you, I would love to believe that my life has reached a point to where I can speak to God as a friend. Now, not a friend as he's one of me, but a friend in that he knows me, understands me, he is wholly other, but that he in fact is also wholly with me. To be able to speak with God in those terms. Moses takes the time that he needs to build a relationship to God, and I want to encourage you, you can do the same. Now, if you've been around me much, you know that I absolutely believe this book with my life. It's the Spirit of the Disciplines. Dallas Willard recently passed, but I always go back to this. He has the best, he takes Scripture and he slices it into pieces that make such powerful sense to me. In terms of, you cannot read the book. And I'll say, it's not Theology 101. It's probably Theology 301. But he is so clear about how he believes and Scripture teaches that we can and must be transformed. If we are simply the same reproduction of who we've been all of our life and we never stir any deeper roots in our spiritual life, then something's wrong. He says we are always being transformed in the presence and the power and the possibility of God. Now, what better time to think about this than Lent? Lent is that time. We Baptists don't talk a lot about it, but it's that time that starts this Wednesday, and it's a 40-day period of sacrifice, of preparation for the resurrection. Lent is to Easter what Advent is to Christmas. So, if you are tuned in this Tuesday, what's Tuesday called? Fat Tuesday. That's right, Fat Tuesday, and then Ash Wednesday. And that's when the transition starts, and that's when people talk about giving something up. Let me give you, we've been talking about mountains this morning. Let's talk a little bit about the Lenten season is marked by two mountains. At the beginning, there is this Mount Hermon, to which we catch a glimpse of Jesus in glory, the Mount of Transfiguration. Remember that? Matter of fact, if you follow the church calendar, today is Transformation Day. It's Transfiguration Day. But then when we get our way to Easter, it's the Good Friday and the Mount Calvary. That's the mountain we will see climbed there. And notice the difference between those two. One is that it's the promise, the hope, the vision of what God is doing. The other one is the cost of what it costs to have salvation. And in between those two mountains, what is there? There is temptation and suffering. There is discipline and confession. You're going to see the picture of a young lady on the screen in just a minute, and you need to look at her face. And if you've not seen her face, you need to see it. If you don't know her name, you need to know her name. Her name is Kayla Mueller. She's the American whose death, while in captivity of ISIS, is making global headlines, and it needs to. Read a little bit about this young lady's life, and it will rock you. She had been working with Syrian refugees when she was captured in 2013 at the age of 24. 5 years ago, she wrote to her father these words: "I will always seek God. Some people find God in church. Some people find God in nature. Some people find God in love. I find God in suffering. I've known for some time what my life's work is, using my hands as tools to relieve suffering." Now, the next time you want to whine a little bit, let me introduce you to her. I mean, come on. A lady who said, I'm supposed to serve. It's what God's claim on my life is. She wrote her aunt, and her aunt said of her these words. She said, she has done more in her incredible 26 years than many people can ever imagine doing in their lifetime. Kayla has touched the heart of the world, and I would say to you, she has. Message number one, take time to build a relationship with God. Message number two is expect your relationship with God to change you. That's the whole issue of when I pointed you to the book, The Spirits of the Disciplines, that you and I ought to allow God's Spirit through prayer, through regular worship attendance, through Bible study, all the things that we're doing. I do not believe you can be in our church right now and participate in the things that we're laying out in front of you and not be transformed. Do you know that 2016 is going to be yet again the year of the Transformers? That's right. Another blockbuster film is coming about the fantastic world of shape-shifting alien robots that disguise themselves into man-made automobiles, and then they morph into something that flies away. Now, you might be thinking, well, that it couldn't be the year of 2016. It wasn't that the year of the Transformers in 2014, and of course you would be right. And if you have a good memory, you would also be right to know that it was the year of 2007, the 2009, and 11, because these Transformers have been around so much so that there's $3.6 billion been spent on going to these movies. And I don't know about you, but I've never seen one of them, and yet I know I'm a grandfather and I'm likely to see one in my future. But why are they interesting? Why do they make sense? Why are they popular? Well, one reason is you've got some grandfathers who grew up with Transformers, and I think if you did, then you want your kids to have them. So there's a kind of nostalgic factor to it. But also, they're just plain fun because they can start out as something and become something else. But I think ultimately, at the core of what is valuable here is that everybody wants to be more than they are. There is this marvelous possibility that we can be more than we just are. There are times where I was a pimpled young teenager saying, I want to be more. There was a time when I looked into the face of God and I said, I want to be more. You may think it's a stretch, but I think there's a connection between the success of that film franchise and the fact of all of us seeking some level of transformation. I've mentioned to you this Sunday being the Transfiguration Sunday, and if you remember much about Jesus, he went up with 3 of his disciples, and there they had a profound time of the presence of God when Jesus was talking with 2 of the other prophets, one of them Moses, and there was such an engagement that they didn't want to leave. They wanted to build tabernacles up there. Barbara Brown Taylor, one of the finest preachers I've ever heard speak, really, she says, it is as if God took the glory off of his face and tucked it inside him. God hid it there in Jesus to see if people would still discern the glory without the visual aid. Still, what happened in the mountain must have helped Jesus. It must have helped him to know what was inside of him, even as if it was not always visible. What we are asked to believe is that at certain breakthrough moments in time, the glory of God is certifiably visible. But seeing it may not be the most important thing, because we are also asked to believe in it when we cannot see it. This thing about spiritual growth is about seeing glimpses of the power and the presence of God, and then when we don't see it, to believe it still. Some of you have gone through some real shadowy times recently. I know that. I've walked with some of you. It has not been easy to live the life that you're in right now. And it's only because you've had so many of those private, powerfully transforming moments in your life that you're able to sustain your way through there. After Moses saw the fire of God's glory, he had put on a veil because of the face that had become so radiant. After the shepherds of Bethlehem saw the glory of the Lord, after they had searched for Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, then they went on to tell the others. After the disciples saw the glory of Jesus and the transfiguration, they had an incredible new appreciation for his connection to God the Father. And after the first Christians saw the glory of God in Jesus, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth, it says, they went out into the world to tell that good news. And you and I are right there again. We follow in that tradition. We follow in that story. We see the glory of God, and we've got to ask the classic question, if we were being put to trial for being a person of faith, would there be enough evidence to convict us? There's a great, heavy theological passage in the New Testament that reflects this Old Testament passage that talks about the very thing that I'm talking about this morning, the transformation. It says, and all of us with unveiled faces, Paul says this in Corinthians, seeing the glory of God, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. Isn't that exactly what was happening to Moses? And now Paul is transitioning in his own life to that same experience. An expert of Old Testament law, here was one who saw the veil and was playing it in his own life. Point number 3, reach out to everyone, even those who annoy you. Oh, God help us. I'm convinced that my son and daughter's generation text instead of talk, because that way they can control the conversation a whole lot easier. Have you ever seen people sitting at a table texting each other? They literally will do that sometimes. They think it's kind of funny, but they can be around the corner. I mean, it can be anything, because it's so much easier to text. It limits, and you have a sense of control when you do that. Whereas if you're face to face, you don't have that as much anymore. I wonder what would happen if a bunch of liberals and conservatives decided to have a meal together and really be honest with each other and stay in the meal long enough. I wonder if you can imagine, Rachel Maddow, please pass the salt. Glenn Beck, here you go, have some more of this. That would be quite a table, wouldn't it? I found interesting what a lady did a couple years ago. I'm not familiar with her, but I've done a lot of reading about her this week. She's a Serbian performance artist by the name of Marina Abramovic, and she's quite evidently the artist. My guess is her religious affiliation would be New Age. But as I looked at what she had done, you're going to see a picture of an exhibit she did in New York City where she called it a square of light. And what she did every day during the 3 weeks was to sit at that table across from somebody, and she would take members from the audience, and they would simply, in that square of light, keep looking at each other. He said the amazing thing that happened during that was that many people were broken to tears. Why? Because to have somebody truly look at you is something that doesn't happen very much anymore. I don't particularly take her choices about, I'm sure, things of faith, but I do recognize this, the power of engaging into a square of light. That's what we're trying to do by opening doors and venues and opportunities through our 3 initiatives. That's what we are trying to do, to bring a square of light so that we can engage our world. Number 4, keep moving both up and down the mountain. Keep moving. In other words, find God's presence, go back out and love somebody. Find God's power, go back out and love somebody. Find God's unique giftedness in you, go out and love somebody. Passage I've read many, many, many times, and I guess I've referenced it, but this week I kept looking at 1 Corinthians 13. I've got verse 12 in your folder, I think, and on the screen, but even if you go one verse earlier, when I was a child, Paul says, I used to speak as a child, think as a child, reason as a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I will know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known. In other words, the more and more we get face to face with God, the more and more we become like the face of God. So I want to make a case for the face today. That you and I spend our face time with God enough so that when we turn into our world, there will be a glow about us that makes the case for God. Yeah, I know things are different. I know life has changed. Some of you cannot believe the amount of change you've experienced in your life. I like the great prophet Yogi Berra when he used to say, the future ain't what it used to be. And he's probably right, isn't he? I mean, in a profound kind of way. When I came to be your pastor, I think it was actually before I began to be your pastor, I gave you this story, and I pulled it out of my files. It's almost 5 years since I told you this, but I think it's telling that we're talking about this story again now. Will Willimon tells the story about a man who'd long been enamored with the idea of marriage. I've met many of those men and women, by the way. And so he meets the woman of his dreams. He proposes, and they get married, and things go incredibly well at first. And he tells his friends about his new wife, and she was all I ever hoped he could find in a woman. She's beautiful, intelligent, and all the other things. And unfortunately, the initial bliss did not last, and gradually he began to notice some of her imperfections. She was beautiful, but she wasn't always beautiful. She was intelligent, but there was definitely some gaps in her knowledge. And slowly he found himself growing cool to this woman. And it had been fun with her on Saturday night, but the marriage wasn't all of that. Marriage was cornflakes for breakfast and sleeping with someone with curlers and disagreements over finances and visits from relatives. And, he still believed in love more than ever, but he continued to cling to the idea of marriage, but the experience of marriage was heavy. Willimon writes that in a book, and it's not about a book about marriage, it's a book about the church. And he said, what's right with the church? He says, no church will ever measure up to the ideal. Should that bother us? Yes. Should it make us quit? No. Should it make us leave one church to search for a perfect church? Good luck on that. And should it make us pray more and work harder to improve the life and the fellowship of that church? You bet.